Hello Underdogger, it's your boy Underdog Recapped. Before we start, warning, spoilers ahead. Today, we are going to recap a 2002 American biographical crime movie inspired by a true event, called Catch Me If You Can. A notorious con artist lives a life of deception until he finally meets his real fate and turns his conning skills to serve a greater purpose. How would it turn out for him? Let's find out together, in a doggy-styled recap. Posing as a Pan American Airways pilot, Frank William Abagnale Jr. is featured on the game show To Tell the Truth. Having defrauded banks of nearly $4 million before the age of 19, he is one of the youngest and most cunning con men in U.S. history. When asked about the person who caught him, Frank has flashbacks of his miserable days when he was imprisoned in Marseille in 1969. FBI agent Carl Henratty arrived and intended to extradite Frank back to the U.S. Frank attempted to escape from Carl at first but was eventually captured. 6 years earlier, Frank William Abagnale, Sr. received an honor from the fancy New Rochelle Rotary Club. 15-year-old Frank Jr. idolizes his father, inspired by his success in building a career while raising a harmonious family with his French mother Paula. One morning, Frank Sr. asks Frank Jr. to pose as his chauffeur as he is trying to secure a loan. Despite his attempt to convince the bank manager, his loan is denied due to an unresolved tax issue with the IRS. As a result, the family is forced to sell their assets and move out of their grand residence. Frank Jr. also has to transfer from private to public school. On his first day at the new school, Frank pretends to be a substitute teacher to outplay some bullies. Turns out, Frank has displayed early talents for deception and forgery. His mother is seemingly distraught by this behavior, but Frank Sr. is not so concerned. Not long after the move, Frank catches his mother hanging out with one of his father's friends at the apartment and finds out that his parents are getting a divorce. Disappointed upon hearing the news, Frank runs away from home and starts using the checks that were given to him by his father for his 16th birthday, but quickly runs out of money. Relying on the checks to survive, Frank creates fake checks, altering the birth date and name. He pulls some confidence tricks he learned from his father to persuade banks to cash the checks but meets with very little success. One day, he encounters a group of pilots and flight attendants, respected and adored by many. Seeing this, Frank decides to impersonate a Pan Am pilot. To create a perfect lie, he seeks as much information as he can get about becoming a pilot and cons his way to obtain a Pan Am uniform. His plan works perfectly as he got much better treatment from banks and can cash the fake checks easily. After finding out that he could get a higher amount of money using Pan Am payroll checks, Frank obtains Pan Am logos from toy planes and presses them on top of the checks. He then starts cashing the checks at airports and manages to fly as a deadhead across various states. While convincingly posing as a pilot, Frank still uses his confidence tricks to gain the trust of some women. Having learned some valuable information about check routing from a flirtatious bank teller, Frank purchases an MICR encoder to alter the routing numbers printed on each check, which are used to identify specific financial institutions accountable to the payee. The fake routing numbers allowed Frank to cash the checks from banks in one state while his check was being routed to its corresponding branch in another state, buying some time before the bank realized that the check was worthless. Frank has told his father, who ended up running a stationery shop, that he has successfully become a pilot. They meet in a fancy restaurant and emotionally talk about getting their old life back. By the time, FBI agent Carl Henratty has sensed Frank's fraudulent acts but could only refer to him as an unsub since they have very little information about Frank's identity. Carl travels to Los Angeles to track Frank's latest worthless check, which was used to pay for a room in a motel. Upon knowing that the unsub was still checked in, Carl hurriedly goes to his room. Instead of giving in, Frank tells Carl that he is a Secret Service agent named Barry Allen and that Frank has been caught by his partner. Not knowing what his unsub looks like, Carl trusts Frank, but when he leaves the room and flees, Carl realizes that Frank is his unsub. Disappointed, Carl reports to his supervisor. On Christmas Eve, Carl gets an unexpected call from Frank, who invites him to meet face-to-face at a hotel, but Carl refuses to trust him. Carl realizes that Frank called because he has no one else to talk to. He is overjoyed that his investigation is finally going somewhere. After surprisingly learning that the name Barry Allen was derived from a comic book character, Carl concludes that Frank, his unsub, is actually a kid, which is why the FBI did not have any record of him and was unable to find a fingerprint that matches the one they found at the Los Angeles motel. Remembering that Frank referred to the New York Yankees during their call earlier, Carl requests the NYPD to track juvenile runaways. Since Paula has filed a runaway report, Carl visits her residence. Turns out, she has married her ex-husband's friend, the one Frank encountered at the apartment. Carl asks to see a picture of Frank, which Carl quickly recognizes and confirms as their unsub. Before leaving, Carl reveals to Paula that Frank had stolen $1.3 million by forging checks. In Georgia, Frank goes to a hospital and has an interest in Brenda Strong, a naive, young nurse. Frank admits to Brenda that he is a doctor named Frank Connors. To take his lie further, Frank applies as a doctor at the hospital with a forged diploma and a fake resume. He is successfully hired as an emergency room doctor and has Brenda working under his supervision. Despite having no knowledge about medical practices, Frank is able to con his way into gaining respect from his subordinates. Frank informs his father that he has quitted his job as a pilot and taken a night job at a hospital. In search of Frank, Carl visits Frank Sr.'s apartment. When asked about his son's whereabouts, Frank Sr. becomes slightly defensive and stands up for him. While exploring the apartment, Carl coincidentally sees a letter from Frank with his address in Atlanta, Georgia, and immediately travels there. He barges into Frank's apartment but finds no one. He sees Frank's forged Harvard diploma and hurries to the hospital only to learn that Frank had quit it. Meanwhile, Frank and Brenda continue developing their romantic relationship. Suggesting that he could help Brenda to talk to her parents who kicked her out a couple of years back, both of them go to Brenda's parents' residence in New Orleans. Turns out, Brenda's father is a powerful, well-connected lawyer. Frank lies to Brenda's parents, telling them that he is a Lutheran like them and had passed the bar exam in California, making him a qualified lawyer in addition to a doctor. Convinced by Frank's lies and confession of his sincere love for Brenda, her parents eventually give their blessing and offer Frank a position at Brenda's father's office. To qualify for the job, Frank takes a bar exam in Louisiana. Brenda's family is reunited and they start preparations for the wedding. Frank meets his father at a bar in New York and passes him his wedding invitation. Cornered by Frank's continuous encouragement to keep fighting for Paula, Frank Sr. reveals to his son that Paula had been married to his friend. He also tells Frank that the FBI had visited him, but instead of ordering him to stop the cons, he tells Frank that the FBI would not be able to catch him. Upset with his father's ignorant behavior, Frank purposefully leaves. On the following Christmas Eve, Frank calls Carl and offers a truce as he planned to get settled with Brenda, to which Carl refuses. At that point, Frank had defrauded banks of almost $4 million. After the call, Carl successfully obtains more information about Frank's engagement and location. He goes to Brenda's residence, where the engagement party is being held, and meets Brenda's parents. Panicked over Carl's arrival, Frank reveals his true identity to Brenda and convinces her to meet him at the Miami International Airport without telling anyone. He then abruptly leaves the house. 2 days later, as Frank has requested, Brenda goes to the airport. Frank spots Brenda getting out of a cab, but before reaching her out, he notices a number of disguised FBI agents nearby and decides not to come to her. Turns out, they are indeed Carl's agents. When Frank fails to fetch Brenda, Carl orders his men to be on standby at different spots within the airport as he is convinced that Frank would have to show up eventually. Not running out of ways, Frank poses as a Pan Am pilot and pretends to recruit new flight attendants from local universities. After holding a series of interviews, Frank picks some of the most attractive girls and takes them to the airport. All eyes are on the entourage as they enter the airport. Carl's men, who were assigned to guard several spots, are also completely distracted by the girls. As a result, Frank successfully gets on a plane and flees to Europe. 7 months later, Carl is still keeping an eye on Frank, who has pulled even bolder cons in many different countries. However, instead of forging checks to draw money, Frank starts making real checks from scratch. In spite of Carl's confidence, his supervisor refuses to support his proposal to go to Europe to chase Frank. Upon analyzing the checks that Frank made, Carl goes to a professional printer who reveals that such flawless checks could only be printed in some European countries. Remembering that Paula has once mentioned that she was born in a village in France, Carl tracks Frank down to the village and finds him in a printing factory. Carl persuades Frank to give in and come with him unless he wanted to get killed by the French police waiting outside of the factory, but not buying into what Carl said, Frank attempts to escape. However, Carl keeps convincing Frank not to escape. He ultimately gives in and puts handcuffs on himself. When Frank is forcefully taken by the French police, Carl promises to have him extradited back to the US. Cut to the present day, on the flight back to the US, Carl curiously asks Frank how he managed to pass the bar exam in Louisiana, but Frank did not answer. He asks Carl to let him call his father as soon as they land. However, Carl regrettably tells Frank that his father is deceased. Devastated upon hearing the news, Frank grieves deeply in the lavatory and escapes through a toilet seat that connects to the landing gear compartment. After a few moments, Carl realizes that Frank has escaped. Frank goes to find his mother's new house and sees a girl inside. Before Frank could say anything to his mother, Carl arrives and takes him to prison. Despite being a minor, Frank is put in the maximum security prison in Atlanta for 12 years and is kept in isolation. During one of his regular visits, Carl tells Frank that he is chasing another alleged check forger and shows the check to him. From the date stamps on the check, Frank quickly identifies the check as a fake and tells Carl that the forger is a bank teller. Sometime later, Carl pays Frank another visit, but this time with his supervisor. He shows Frank another check and once again, Frank is able to tell whether the check is real and catch the specific details on the check as soon as he looks at it. Impressed by Frank's ability, Carl's supervisor offers Frank to work with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit for the remainder of his sentence under Carl's custody. Frank agrees and starts working as a check fraud expert. On a weekend, Frank runs out of ideas and decides to pose as a Pan Am pilot like he used to do. Carl tails him to the airport, but trusting that Frank will not be running away anymore, he lets him get away. The following Monday, Carl is relieved to see Frank back in the office. To satisfy Carl's curiosity about how he passed the bar exam in Louisiana, Frank tells Carl that he studied for 2 weeks and passed without cheating. Frank was released from prison in 1974. Ever since then, he has helped the FBI capture some of the most cunning check forgers. He has also designed secure checks that banks and major companies use. Remaining friends with Carl, Frank is now considered one of the most respected authorities on bank fraud and forgery. The movie explores the costs, rewards, and ethical dilemmas of fraudulent acts. Just because you started off on the wrong path, it does not mean that you should stay on that path forever. With simple acts of encouragement and trust from the people closest to us, we can always turn our lives around for the better. Let us know what you think in the comment below. Don't forget to subscribe, and see you in our next recap.